Rancher lived alone for years until the Bigfoot dragged a woman to his ranch. One fog swallowed the ranch that morning, wrapping every fence post in silence. Then came 3 heavy knocks on the door. James Harlow had lived alone for years, no visitors, no sound but wind and hoofbeats. When he opened the door, the fog leaned in, and so did something else. A massive figure fur, dripping with rain, stood in the haze. In its hand, large enough to crush a man, it carried a woman, barefoot, torn, barely breathing. Their eyes met man and legend, fear meeting reason. But the creature didn't attack. It laid her gently on the porch, then vanished back into the woods, leaving behind a small bundle of herbs on the step. Sometimes what saves us from loneliness doesn't look human at all. Before we begin, take a moment to comment the name of your city. Where are you watching from tonight? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. The fog that morning hung heavy over the northern Washington hills, a slow-moving ocean of white swallowing every fence post and pine. Dew dripped from the sagging roof of an old ranch that hadn't seen a visitor in more than a decade. Inside, James Harlow, 52, moved with the quiet rhythm of a man long used to silence. He'd been alone for 10 years, no wife, no children, only the creak of old wood and the distant call of crows to remind him the world was still turning. He stepped outside with a hammer in hand, ready to mend another loose board on the fence. The mud clung to his boots, thick and black. Then it came 3 heavy knocks. Slow, certain. They didn't belong to any man he knew. The cabin door shuddered under their weight. James froze, breath visible in the cold. His fingers brushed the rifle leaning by the wall. For a heartbeat there was only wind and his racing pulse. Then with a deep breath he lifted the latch. The door groaned open, spilling fog into the warm glow of the cabin, and through it stepped something enormous, a towering figure, fur soaked with rain shoulders, broad as the doorway itself. In one hand, large enough to crush stone, it dragged a woman, barefoot clothes torn, her face pale against the dark. James raised the Winchester, but the creature did not attack. Instead, it knelt, lowering the woman gently onto the porch. One massive finger steadied her before she fell. Their eyes met man and legend, and in that stillness, James saw no rage, no hunger, only the calm, haunting gaze of someone who had just done the right thing. Part 1. The Awakening. The fire cracked softly, painting amber lines across the cabin walls. The smell of burning pine filled the air, chasing away the damp that crept in through every crack of the old wooden house. Outside, the wind still moaned low through the valley, pressing against the windows like a restless spirit that refused to sleep. James Harlow sat on a stool by the stove, his rough hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. The world outside might have been carved from ice and fog, but in here warmth flickered in uncertain waves, not just from the fire, but from something deeper, heavier, that he could not yet name. On the deer leather couch beside the hearth lay the woman the creature had left behind. Her face was pale, lips cracked, lashes fluttering with the effort of waking. A faded wool blanket covered her up to the shoulders. James had found one of his old handkerchiefs to bind a scrape along her arm. The sight of his own faded initials stitched into the cloth struck him strangely, like a memory surfacing from another life, a life where he still cared about things like initials or handkerchiefs or keeping someone warm. For years he had built his world around silence. Silence was simpler than grief, but now that silence was broken by her breathing, shallow, trembling, fragile, James stood, poured another cup of coffee, then set it down on the small table beside her. Steam rose slowly, twisting in the cold light. She stirred. A faint sound escaped her throat, half sigh, half moan. Her fingers twitched beneath the blanket. When her eyes opened, they were wide, unfocused, catching the flicker of fire, as if unsure of what was real. He crouched down so she could see his face clearly. "You're safe," he said quietly. "You're at my ranch. You've been hurt." Her lips moved, cracked and dry. No sound came at first. Then a whisper, ragged and weak. "It saved me." James frowned, unsure he'd heard right. What she swallowed tried again. "That thing saved me." The words hung there in the air, heavier than the smoke. He looked toward the door, still bolted, still trembling faintly in the wind. His eyes drifted to the muddy floorboards near the threshold where the giant footprints had begun to dry. Each one looked deep enough to hold a man's fear. James turned back to the woman. She'd fallen asleep again, exhaustion overtaking her like a wave. Her face softened, the lines of pain fading for the moment. He sat beside her, elbows on knees, eyes on the floor. Saved her. The thought didn't fit with the stories. Out here, Bigfoot wasn't a guardian. It was a myth people whispered about when the whiskey ran low and the night ran long. Hunters told tales of glowing eyes in the dark, of shredded carcasses found near the tree line. And yet, the creature he saw, that look in its eyes, it wasn't hate. It wasn't hunger. It was something else. James rose and walked to the door. The smell of the forest seeped through the cracks. Cold earth, wet pine, the faint sweetness of decay. He pulled the latch and stepped outside. The fog still lingered, curling low around the fence posts. His boots sank into the mud. The tracks were clearer now, massive, wide, as a skillet pressed deep into the earth. Between them, smaller prints, human ones, light, uneven. Hers. The two trails met at the porch, as if her path had ended where his began. James followed the prints a few feet toward the gate before stopping. There, half buried in the mud, lay something wrapped in leather cord, the herb bundle he'd noticed earlier. It was tied neatly with purpose. Inside were small sprigs of pine-crushed leaves and wildflowers he didn't recognize. He lifted it to his nose. The scent was thick and alive, pine sap, damp soil, and something faintly sweet like rain on bark. It filled his chest with a feeling he hadn't felt in years. Peace. He stood there for a long time, breathing it in, listening to the forest breathe with him. Somewhere beyond the fog, a crow called its echo rolling through the trees. Back inside the cabin felt different, warmer somehow. The woman Clara, he decided she might be named, stirred again. He moved quietly, not wanting to startle her. Her eyes opened slowly, clearer this time. "Where?" she murmured. "Where am I?" "My ranch," he said. "You've been out cold. Found you on my porch this morning." She blinked, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "You saw it, didn't you?" He hesitated. "I saw something." Her voice trembled, but not from fear, from memory. It came out of the trees when the wolves closed in. "I thought it was going to kill me, but it didn't. It chased them away. It—" She paused, catching her breath, eyes glistening. "It carried me. I tried to scream, but I couldn't move. Then I remember fog and a door." James said nothing. He poured her a small cup of coffee, added a bit of honey from a jar that had been there for years. She took it with both hands, trembling. Outside, the wind howled once more, a hollow cry slipping through the cracks. "Rest," he said. "You're safe here." She nodded weakly, but her gaze wandered toward the door, the same place his eyes had lingered earlier. "It'll come back," she whispered. "I think it wanted to make sure I lived." He didn't know what to say. When she drifted back to sleep, James returned to the hearth. The fire was dying down, embers glowing red beneath the ash. He poked it gently, feeding another log into the flames. The sparks climbed bright and brief before fading. He looked down at the herb bundle on the table beside him. It wasn't just a plant offering. It was a message: we mean no harm. James traced the leather cord with his thumb, feeling the rough texture. His reflection wavered in the coffee tin firelight, rippling across his weathered face. For 10 long years he'd lived without company, without a reason to speak more than a handful of words a day. But now, in a single morning, his solitude had been cracked open by something impossible, by a myth that acted with compassion. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the window pane where fog pressed like a living thing. Beyond it, the forest loomed endless, dark, unknowable. Yet for the first time in a decade, James didn't feel alone. He let out a slow breath and whispered to the empty room, "Whatever you are, thank you." The wind eased and the fire answered with a gentle pop. Outside, hidden by the mist, something moved, a shadow among the pines, pausing just long enough to listen before vanishing back into the forest. Part 2, The Sign in the Mud. The sun slid behind the ridgeline early that evening, leaving the ranch bathed in gray light. The fog, once thin, began to thicken again, curling low over the ground like breath from the earth itself. The wind had changed slower now, heavier, carrying the damp scent of pine and rain-soaked moss. James Harlow stepped out onto the porch, pulling his coat tight around his shoulders. The boards creaked under his boots. Behind him, the cabin glowed faintly with the firelight, the woman Clara still asleep inside. Her breathing had steadied, but her body was weak. He'd checked on her before stepping out, making sure the blanket covered her shoulders and the kettle stayed warm by the fire. Now the ranch was quiet, except for the faint rattle of the loose shutters. Out here, twilight didn't fade gently. It sank like a stone swallowing color until only shadow remained. James walked down the steps into the yard, his boots sinking into the mud. The air was thick enough to taste cold wet, full of ghosts from the forest. He moved carefully, following the faint line of the fence toward the northwest corner, where the fog seemed deepest. That was where he'd found the first tracks this morning, massive, deliberate, each print pressed deep as if the creature weighed the world itself. As he neared the corner, he stopped. The fence there had collapsed. A post lay splintered, snapped clean at the base. He knelt, brushing away the wet grass. The mud still held shaped large footprints, unmistakable, pointing toward the forest. But something else caught his eye. Just beside the giant impressions were smaller ones, softer, lighter, not human. Too wide for a child's foot, too short for an adult. 2 toes splayed slightly outward, the weight uneven like something still learning how to walk. James's breath slowed. "You've got a young one," he muttered under his breath. He crouched there for a long moment, studying the ground, piecing together a story written in mud. The large prints circled the smaller ones, always between them and the trees. A pattern of protection. A father and child. The realization sank into him like the cold. The creature, that thing people feared, hadn't just dragged a stranger to safety. It had come from a place of its own, a life beyond the myth. James looked up toward the forest. Through the fog, the pines loomed in gray silhouettes, unmoving. Somewhere in there, a family hid, unseen, unspoken of. He thought about the last time he'd spoken the word family out loud. 10 years ago, maybe more. Back when his wife Martha still sang in the mornings, her voice drifting through the yard like sunlight through leaves. She'd died that winter, fever took her fast. The snow had piled high, cutting him off from town. He buried her himself behind the barn under a maple tree that bloomed bright red every spring. Since then, he hadn't said her name aloud. Not once. But standing there now, staring at the pattern of footprints, he felt that old ache stir again, the kind that never leaves, only sleeps. The creature wasn't alone in the wild. And maybe he didn't have to be either. The sky dimmed to steel gray. Fog rose higher, brushing the tops of his boots. The air grew still, unnaturally still. No crickets, no wind through pine needles, not even the distant cry of crows. Only silence, thick as frost. Then from somewhere deep within the woods came a sound, low, drawn-out, resonant. Not a growl, not a howl. Something between the two, rolling through the valley like thunder trapped beneath the trees. James froze, the hair on his arms rising. The sound came again, closer this time, then stopped, suddenly swallowed by fog. He turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Between the shadows of the pines, something shifted, just enough for his instincts to scream. "All right," he whispered, gripping the strap of his rifle, though he didn't lift it. "I know you're out there." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It watched. He could feel it, eyes in the mist, steady, deliberate, not predatory, observing, measuring. His pulse slowed. Every breath clouded before him, pale and quick. For the first time, he didn't feel hunted. He felt tested. James looked back at the smaller footprints, half filled with water now. He thought of the bundle of herbs on his table, the carrot had been tied with. Whoever, whatever had made those prints, it wasn't just passing through. It had come with intent. He raised his eyes toward the fog, toward that unseen presence hovering just beyond the trees. His voice was low but steady. "If it comes back," he said quietly, more to himself than to the night, "I won't raise the gun." The words left his mouth like smoke hanging in the damp air before disappearing into the mist. A branch cracked in the distance, not from a predator's charge, but from movement slow and deliberate. He waited, heart thudding. For a moment he thought he saw a figure, a tall outline darker than the fog standing between the trees. Then the shape melted away, fading as though it had never been there. He exhaled, not realizing he'd been holding his breath. The wind began again, whispering through the fence wire. Somewhere far off, a raven cawed once twice, and the valley exhaled with it. James straightened, brushing the mud from his hands. He took one last look at the prints before turning back toward the cabin. The fog followed him, halfway curling around his boots, as if reluctant to let him go. When he reached the porch, he paused and looked back. The tracks were already softening, the edges melting under a fine drizzle. By morning, they'd be gone. But their meaning, that quiet revelation of connection, lingered like the scent of pine on his clothes. Inside, Clara stirred. Her voice was faint, almost part of the wind. "Is it still out there?" James stood in the doorway, the dim firelight spilling across his face. "Maybe," he said, "but I don't think it means us harm." She smiled, weakly, eyes heavy with exhaustion. "You sound sure." He looked out into the fog one last time. "I'm not," he admitted, "but sometimes you have to believe the forest has its reasons." He shut the door gently, the latch clicking into place. Outside, the mist thickened again, erasing the yard, the fence, the world beyond the porch light. Deep in the forest, hidden among the ancient pines, something breathed, slow, rhythmic, almost human. And for a brief moment the sound matched the heartbeat of the man inside the cabin. Two worlds divided by fog, yet pulsing to the same rhythm. Part 3. The night of the howl. Night had come fast, the way it always did in the northern hills. One moment the world glowed silver in mist. The next it was swallowed whole by darkness. The wind screamed through the valley, rattling the windows of James Harlow's cabin. Inside the fire burned low shadows, swaying across the log walls like restless ghosts. Clara slept near the hearth, her breathing slow and even now. The color had returned to her cheeks, though her face still bore the faint marks of fear and exhaustion. James sat in his chair by the stove, one boot crossed over the other, a half-empty cup of coffee in hand. The warmth seeped through the tin, but his mind was far from calm. He hadn't told Clara what he'd found earlier: the broken fence, the prints in the mud, the smaller tracks alongside the larger ones. She needed rest, not more questions. But he couldn't stop thinking about it. The image replayed in his head, massive footprints circling smaller ones, careful, protective, like a parent shielding its child. The clock above the mantel ticked faintly. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, thick and white, so that the world beyond seemed to vanish entirely. James sipped his coffee, the bitter taste grounding him in the stillness. Then the stillness broke. A sound rolled through the forest, deep, guttural, ancient. It wasn't close, but it was powerful enough to make the cup in his hand tremble. The liquid rippled inside, faint rings spreading across its surface. James froze. His pulse kicked up, heart slamming against his ribs. He set the cup down quietly, reached for the rifle leaning against the wall, and moved toward the door. Another roar followed, this time closer. It wasn't the sound of pain or rage. It was a call, long and low, echoing off the trees and coming back doubled by the valley. James's hand hovered over the latch. He hesitated. Part of him wanted to stay inside, lock the door, pretend the world beyond the fog didn't exist. But something deeper, something wordless and old, pulled him forward. He opened the door. Cold air rushed in, biting his skin. The porch creaked under his weight as he stepped out. The night was thick, the fog drifting like smoke through the trees. Every sound was magnified, the hiss of wind through the grass, the soft thud of his boots on wet wood. And then he saw it. Beyond the fence, half shrouded by fog, a shape enormous still. The faint shimmer of eyes caught the dim glow from the cabin, reflecting it like polished amber. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just those eyes and the silence between them. James didn't move. Neither did the creature. The wind pushed the fog aside for an instant, and the shape came clearer. Broad shoulders, fur, slick with rain steam rising faintly from its breath. It wasn't charging. It wasn't hiding. It was watching. James felt his throat tighten. The instinct to run, to raise the gun, all of it burned away beneath something heavier. Recognition. He lowered the rifle. "You again," he whispered. "You're watching her, aren't you?" The creature shifted slightly, the sound of its movement like the creak of old leather. It didn't answer, of course, but the stillness spoke volumes. For a long moment, man and legend stared across the fence that divided their worlds. The fear that had once ruled James's heart now came back as something different. Not terror, but awe. It wasn't the kind of awe that made you kneel or pray. It was quieter than that. It was the awe of realizing you weren't as alone as you thought. A sudden gust of wind tore through the yard, bending the grass, shaking the porch posts. The fog thinned just enough for James to see the creature's full height. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, built like stone given breath. Yet there was grace in the way it stood, balanced, patient, as if it understood the fragility of the moment. Then, from somewhere far off, a gunshot. Sharp, violent. It cracked the night open like lightning splitting a tree. The sound echoed once, twice, and was followed by another closer. James flinched. His eyes snapped toward the tree line. The creature turned, 2 muscles tensing beneath its fur. It looked toward the woods, then back toward the cabin. James felt his stomach drop. Hunters. He stepped forward instinctively. "No," he muttered. "No, not tonight." The creature took a step back, gaze darting toward the forest as another gunshot rolled across the valley. "Go," James whispered hoarsely. "They'll kill you." For a moment the Bigfoot hesitated, those glowing eyes locked on his. Then it turned, moving with startling speed for something so large. Its steps were silent, almost mournful. James gripped the fence rail, watching the dark shape blur into fog, then vanish entirely into the forest. A final echoing crack split the air. James raised the rifle not to shoot, but to signal. He fired a single round straight into the sky. The sound boomed over the hills. "Don't shoot!" he shouted into the night, voice breaking against the wind. "It's not your enemy." The words were ripped away, almost instantly swallowed by the howling gale. He stood there, breath steaming in the cold, listening. The forest fell quiet. No more gunfire. No more howls. Just the wind soft now like a sigh. James lowered the rifle. His shoulders slumped. The adrenaline left him all at once, leaving only exhaustion. He stayed there for a while, leaning against the fence, staring into the dark until the fog became one endless wall again. When he finally turned back toward the cabin, he saw Clara standing at the window, her face pale in the firelight. She hadn't spoken, but her eyes asked the question anyway. He opened the door, stepping inside, boots dripping mud onto the floor. "Was it back?" she whispered. He nodded. It was watching the cabin. Did it hurt anyone?" "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "It didn't come for us." She glanced toward the door, her voice almost trembling. "Then why the gunshots?" James looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "Because the world doesn't believe in gentle monsters." The words came out low, almost to himself. Clara wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, sitting near the fire. The wind outside softened, brushing the windows with the quiet rhythm of a heartbeat. James took a long breath and stared out through the window again, though there was nothing to see, only fog and the faint outline of the broken fence. He thought of the creature standing there under the moonless sky, keeping watch not out of duty but out of understanding. It had protected her once, and tonight, in its own way, it had done so again. As the clock ticked past midnight, James whispered softly into the quiet cabin, "If it comes back, I'll be ready. Not with fear, not with a rifle, but with trust." Outside, in the distant dark of the forest, a low sound rose, not a growl, but a call deep and sorrowful. It echoed once through the valley and faded into the wind, leaving behind a silence that felt almost sacred. Part 4. The return at dawn. The night had finally loosened its grip on the valley. What began as a whisper of gray along the horizon slowly bled into a thin, fragile gold. The first light of dawn crept through the mist, brushing the tops of the pine trees with faint silver, and the forest seemed to exhale as if it too had survived the long, haunted night. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to embers. James Harlow sat half awake in his chair, the rifle leaning untouched by the door. The wind had died some time after midnight, leaving behind a silence that was neither heavy nor hollow, but calm, the kind that follows understanding. Clara still slept, her face turned toward the window. The faint light fell across her features, softening the lines of worry that had haunted her since the moment she'd arrived. For the first time since she'd come, her breathing sounded peaceful. James rubbed a hand over his eyes and stood stretching the stiffness from his back. Something about the air felt different, lighter charged with quiet intention. He walked toward the door boots creaking on the old boards and paused with his hand on the latch. When he opened it, the cold morning air flooded in sharp but clean. The yard shimmered with dew, every blade of grass carrying a drop of light. The fog still clung low, curling between fence posts, but the world no longer felt threatening. Then he saw it. Right there on the porch, just beyond the steps, lay a small circle of stones carefully arranged in the mud. Each stone was smooth-rounded and placed with precision, forming a half-moon shape that pointed toward the forest. At the center rested a bundle of herbs, tied neatly with fresh bark cord. The leaves glistened with dewdrops of water catching the first light of dawn. James froze. His chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with something far deeper. He stepped closer, crouching down. The stones weren't random. Something had built this deliberately. A symbol. A message. He picked up one of the stones, feeling its weight still cool from the night air. A peace offering. James's eyes drifted toward the tree line. The fog there was thick, rolling like a slow tide, but he swore he saw movement, a dark shape shifting between the pines, large and still. Watching. He swallowed hard. The memory of last night's gunshots rang faintly in his ears. He thought of the creature standing guard at the fence, of its eyes gleaming like amber in the fog. He thought of the way it had turned away when danger approached, not out of fear, but to prevent bloodshed. Now, in the pale light of morning, this was its answer. Not words, not sound, just quiet understanding. He bent down and lifted the herb bundle. The smell was fresh pine wild mint, a hint of something sweet he couldn't name. The same fragrance as before, but stronger, more deliberate. As he stood there holding it, a strange warmth spread through him, the kind that had nothing to do with the fire. Behind him, Clara's voice broke the silence, soft, hesitant. "Is it gone?" James turned slightly. She stood at the doorway, blanket still around her shoulders, her hair tangled from sleep. He nodded. "I think so." She stepped onto the porch, eyes widening as she noticed the circle of stones. "Did you make that?" He shook his head slowly. "No." Clara knelt beside the stone's fingertips, brushing one of them. "What does it mean?" He looked out toward the misty woods. "I think it means peace." They stood there together, the fog curling around their boots, the morning light breaking through in golden streaks. Somewhere in the forest, a bird began to call, a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to echo through the trees. Clara looked at him. "Do you think it understands you?" James smiled faintly, eyes still fixed on the woods. "Maybe it understands better than most men." A gust of wind rippled through the grass, carrying the scent of pine and rain. For a moment, the fog parted. There, near the edge of the forest, stood a silhouette. Tall, broad, unmistakable, Bigfoot. The creature didn't move forward. It simply stood half shrouded by light and mist, the morning sun catching in the sheen of its fur. Its breath rose in slow, visible clouds, merging with the dawn. James took a step forward, heart pounding, not with fear, but with something close to reverence. The two faced each other across the yard, man and legend, separated by distance and nature, but bound by an unspoken truth. Neither had chosen this meeting, yet both knew it mattered. James lifted the herb bundle slightly, as if to return the gesture. "Guess we both just want peace." "Don't we?" he said, voice low and rough with emotion. The creature tilted its head, a subtle, deliberate motion, a nod. Then it turned slowly toward the forest, its steps leaving deep prints in the wet ground. The fog swallowed it piece by piece first, the legs, then the broad shoulders, until only the faint glimmer of its eyes remained 2 points of light in the pale morning. Then even they were gone. Silence filled the valley. Clara exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath the whole time. "Was that real?" she whispered. James didn't answer. He just kept staring at the place where the figure had disappeared. A small smile crept across his face, not of disbelief, but of quiet acceptance. He knelt again, carefully resetting the stones that had shifted under their feet. "Real enough," he murmured. When he looked up again, the fog was lifting. The forest was visible now, ancient, vast, and alive. The same world as before, yet entirely changed. He turned back toward Clara. "Inside. Let's get you some breakfast." She nodded, but her eyes lingered on the tree line one last time. "Do you think it'll come back?" James looked at the half-moon circle of stones, at the way the morning light touched them, making each one glimmer like a drop of glass. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I don't think it needs to." They went back inside, closing the door behind them. The latch fell into place with a soft click, not of fear but of understanding. The day outside brightened, the sun finally breaking free of the horizon. Birds called from the forest. The fog thinned to ribbons rising toward the sky. Out there between the old pines, the world seemed at peace. And inside the cabin, for the first time in 10 long years, so did James Harlow. As the light spilled across the valley, the wind shifted one last time, carrying a low, distant sound. Not quite a howl, not quite a hum. A farewell. A promise. A quiet echo of the truth both man and creature had come to understand, that peace, once found, doesn't always need words. Part 5. The Silence. After the morning stretched quietly over the valley, the fog had thinned to a soft veil that drifted lazily through the pines, curling and fading in the rising light. The cabin, once trembling with wind and fear, now stood still, old wood breathing in the calm. Inside, the fire whispered low, its glow flickering against the log walls like the heartbeat of the house itself. Clara slept deeply by the hearth, her face turned toward the warmth, the faintest smile resting on her lips. Whatever had haunted her through the wilderness had finally loosened its grip. At the table by the window, James Harlow sat with a worn leather notebook open before him. His hands were rough-lined with years of work and solitude, yet they moved gently as he wrote, as though afraid to disturb the stillness he had finally come to understand. The pen scratched softly across the yellowed page. "The forest isn't cruel. It just waits for someone to listen." He stared at the words for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. Outside the window, the mist shimmered like glass. The world looked the same as it always had. Fences, half-broken grass, heavy with dew, the distant mountains lost behind clouds. But to James, everything felt different. For years, the forest had been his prison, a quiet place where memory and regret echoed louder than wind. He'd built his fences high, not to keep animals out, but to keep the world away. Yet last night a myth had stepped out of the fog and shattered those walls without ever saying a word. James took a deep breath. The air smelled of pine ash and something faintly sweet, the lingering trace of the herb bundle still resting on the mantel. He smiled. He no longer feared the forest. He no longer saw it as something that waited to swallow him whole. Now he could hear its rhythm, soft, patient, alive. Somewhere out there beyond the pines, a creature walked that most would call a monster. But he knew better now. The forest, like the creature, wasn't cruel. It only mirrored what you brought into it, fear or peace. James closed the notebook and placed it beside the window. His reflection shimmered faintly in the glass, a man older, quieter, but not empty. In his eyes, the firelight danced like dawn caught in amber. He whispered softly to the empty room, "Guess we both just needed someone to see us." The wind outside sighed through the trees as though answering him. The last of the fog lifted. For the briefest moment before the sunlight washed everything clean, James thought he saw something at the edge of the forest, a tall silhouette standing still among the shadows. The same calm presence, patient and silent, watching. He didn't reach for the rifle. He didn't even stand. He just nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement across the distance. And then the figure was gone, fading into light. James turned back toward the fire, the corners of his mouth curving slightly. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of gratitude, of the simple knowledge that not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Some are meant to be understood. Sometimes the things we fear the most are the ones that teach us how to feel again. This is Wild West Stories, where mystery meets mercy and every silence heals. If a legendary creature brought someone to your doorstep, what would you do? Leave your answer in the comments and rate today's story from 0 to 10. Camera drifts slowly back through the cabin window. The fire glows. The notebook lies open on the table, the last line still visible. It just waits for someone to listen. Outside, the forest hums softly beneath the rising sun. Two worlds at peace, finally listening to each other.